before letters were born, before the earth knew its name, there were humans not quite like us, yet in their eyes, something of us. In an age unlit by sunlight, they lit small fires to push away the cold. They spoke without words, loved without promises, and mourned in silences no one could hear. They left no books, no buildings, yet their souls still walk behind us, hiding in the quiet and in that longing for which we have no explanation. This is not only a story of science, but the story of a human shadow that passed through the darkness and vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Before the first letter was written, before the first map was drawn, Earth was a world utterly unlike the one we know today. Winter was merciless, lasting months. Snow fell in silence, but did not melt, covering the land in thick layers of frost and stillness. There were no cities, no roads, no homes, only vast forests, deep valleys, and enormous beasts roaming freely, mammoths and saber-toothed cats with curved fangs. In this wild, frozen world lived a kind of human, not quite like us, yet their features resembled ours. Their bones were shorter, stronger, their foreheads more pronounced, their bodies shaped for survival in the bitter cold. They came to be known as the Neanderthals. No one knows who first gave them that name, but it was drawn from a valley in Germany where their bones were discovered. Over time, the name became tied to an entire chapter of human history, a chapter we still do not fully know, but one that lingers within us. The Neanderthals lived in Europe and parts of Western Asia for nearly 300,000 years, until their disappearance around 40,000 years ago. They were not visitors. They were the native children of that land. They carried fire in their hands, dug out shelters, and faced death daily, hunting for food or fleeing some new enemy. Yet they were not monsters, not merely muscle locked in combat with nature. There was something of us in them, something unspoken but deeply felt. Perhaps this is where the true story of what makes us human begins. For those who lived within the ice left more than footprints behind. They left fragments of their way of life, their way of connection, as we will soon see. In a world ruled by wind and endless nights, life was not measured by words or built by stone alone. Neanderthals had to invent their own ways to endure, not just against cold and hunger, but against loneliness. For nature gave them no warm walls, no villages to return to. So they carved their tools from the hardest stone with rough fingers. Flint knives, spear tips sharpened from rock, heavy hammers that lasted for years. These tools were not merely for hunting. They were extensions of their bodies, testaments to skill and patience. Fire was their most loyal companion, not a luxury, but survival itself. They knew how to strike stone against stone, waiting for the first spark, then breathing life into it until flames grew. Around that fragile glow, they gathered during the endless winter nights, chasing a moment of safety in a merciless world. Beneath the smoke, eyes exchanged unspoken messages. Silent hands passed a piece of roasted meat. Stories were told without words, only through stillness, through the long quiet of survival. They had no language as we know it today, but neither were they silent. Their voices carried primitive sounds, hums and calls that held meaning. Though without complex sentences or abstract thought, they lacked the ability to weave ideas into elaborate form, to name subtle emotions with precision. Their communication was limited, instinctive, close to the raw edge of survival. Their faces spoke, their hands explained, their eyes carried meanings, their tongues could not shape. A raised brow, a shift of the shoulder, each movement held weight, enough to warn, enough to comfort, but never enough to build, never enough to paint an idea beyond the present. In their caves, faint whispers echoed against stone, not far, not deep, yet enough, a murmur to calm a child, to warn the tribe of danger. They knew how to speak, but not how to say much, and yet their lives were not empty of tenderness. Archaeologists found the remains of a Neanderthal child in El Sidrón cave in Spain. He had a genetic disease from birth. He was not abandoned. He was cared for until his final breath. What does this mean? It may mean they knew compassion, that their hearts were not colder than ours. Evidence suggests they may have been the earliest artists. In caves, traces of colored pigments appear, perhaps used to adorn skin or stone. Perhaps they pressed their painted hands against walls, declaring, "We are here, we live, we feel, we leave a mark." Even sorrow was not absent. We may never know if they wept, nor how they mourned, but a heart that knows love must also know loss. When one of them sat beside the dead, placing a stone or a dried flower at their side, it was not by chance. It was a message, one we may not fully understand, but one we can deeply feel. Perhaps loneliness was their greatest burden. Despite living in groups, each carried a silent cave within, a solitude heavy and vast. In that silence, some of their deepest emotions may have been born. When silence grows so deep that waiting becomes the only language. Yet their rituals were not all that defined them. Daily life itself was a trial. As we will see in the next part, Neanderthal existence was a relentless struggle, from cold and hunger to the endless fight for survival. Morning began before sunrise, not out of love for the dawn, but because the cold would not wait. Even stepping from the cave was a battle. Winds beat against trees, snow covered the ground, predators could lurk close by. Yet they had to move, to hunt, to gather wood, to find food, for hunger neither forgives nor. There were no granaries, no storage, no safe house waiting. Life was taken one day at a time. At dawn, men, and sometimes women, set out with spears. They watched, silent, tracked prints in snow, listened for the faintest sound. Hours could pass with nothing, or sometimes the prey was closer than they thought, yet far deadlier than they could bear. Hunting was not the heroic tale we imagine. It was often a fight against the unknown. One beast could feed them for days, or take the life of one of their own. Though the Neanderthals were strong, nature always had the upper hand. Muscles alone could not conquer hunger, frost, or fear. For those left behind, life was no softer. Women gathered roots, berries, herbs hidden between rocks. Children, if old enough to walk, helped arrange tools, carried kindling, or simply watched the sky, waiting for the hunters to return. There was no time for play, no space for stories. Every sound, every shadow reminded them, survive. It is a chance. Fire was their heart. Around it, families cooked meat, repaired tools, treated wounds. If the fire died, everything died. Always one pair of eyes stayed fixed upon it, one hand near, ready to feed it, afraid the wind might steal its life. Their days were harsh, their nights harsher still. Winds howled outside the stone walls. Cold crept through even the thickest hides. Sometimes, one of them lay down to sleep and never woke again. Not from sickness, But because the body could no longer endure, no wailing, no noise, only silence carrying the body away. And so life went on with the same quiet, the same caution. But in times of drought or famine, things grew darker. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Neanderthal groups were forced to eat carrion, perhaps even their own dead. Not out of cruelty, but out of survival. In an age that gave nothing freely, they had no choice but to take what remained. Their lives were not only toil and misery. There were small moments of warmth. When a hunter returned carrying meat, when a woman laughed at a child's gesture, when an old spear was repaired and brought back to life, when a flower was discovered pushing through the ice. These moments were rare, but they were precious. Their way of life was not comfortable, but it was real. They knew each day could be their last, and still they tried. They fought cold with skin, hunger with patience, fear with silence. They did not complain, nor did they expect anything. They simply endured. And in the depths of those silent caves, death was not merely an end, but a moment marked with its own rituals, as we will soon discover. When death drew near, it was not met with denial or flight. They had no medicine, no words of comfort, no written rites. But in their silence, and in what they left behind, we find that death was not strange to them, nor fleeting. They understood it in their own way, and faced it as they faced cold and hunger, only this time without fire and without weapons. Across caves from France to Iraq, scientists uncovered astonishing scenes found only among beings who knew grief. In La Chapelle-aux-Saints, in France, the skeleton of a Neanderthal man was found. He had lived past 50 years, an extraordinary age for his time. He suffered from arthritis, had lost many teeth, and seemed unable to chew or walk, yet he lived. He was not abandoned to die alone. His group appears to have cared for him for months, perhaps years. This alone speaks volumes. They were not merely strong hunters, but beings who knew compassion, care, even sacrifice. Deeper still was their way of saying farewell to the dead. In more than one cave, remains were found carefully buried. Bodies were not left for beasts, but laid in pits, covered with sand or clay, sometimes with stones. In some graves, flowers, small tools, or bits of food were found. Some argue these were coincidences, but the repetition across places and centuries points to something deeper. It is as if the Neanderthals were saying something to the departed or to those who remained. In Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, dating back more than 50,000 years, the body of a Neanderthal man was found lying in a grave filled with pollen, flowers, not one or two, but a collection of many types, some with known medicinal properties, some for beauty alone. The flowers were not scattered by wind, but placed carefully by a hand that knew what it was doing. That moment, when a Neanderthal hand bent down to place a flower beside the one they loved, speaks everything. It says they did not see death as mere extinction, but as a farewell worthy of beauty. Perhaps someone even wept. We cannot be sure, but we know tears do not belong only to words. It is enough to imagine one dancing across the wall to know grief lived in those silent eyes. They may have mourned in their own ways, through silence, through pausing the hunt, through sitting beside the body until it grew cold. Often, they buried their dead with small belongings: a stone knife, a carved bone, even a simple knot of dried grass. These things had no material value, but carried deep symbolism. They were fragments of life, tokens to accompany the departed beyond the end. Perhaps they believed in life after death, or perhaps they did not believe at all. Perhaps they simply did not want anyone to leave naked of memory. These rites were not reserved only for adults. Even Neanderthal children were buried tenderly. In some caves, tiny skeletons were found of infants no older than 1 or 2 years. Their bodies were laid in special places, away from paths, in corners that seemed to echo a protective instinct. In some cases, little objects were placed beside them as if toys. No one buries a child in such a way unless they know love. All these details show us that Neanderthals understood absence. They knew death did not end with the last heartbeat. They left traces not only in stone, but in unseen emotions, buried yet real, strong and deeply human. In a world without writing, a flower on a grave was the message. Perhaps this is why, when we look upon those dried flowers, preserved for tens of thousands of years beside ancient bones, we feel something like longing. We realize we are not strangers to them. We are their continuation, not only in genes, but in grief, in ritual, in that moment when we bid farewell to someone we love in long silence, leaving a small object beside them simply because we do not know what else to say. But even the strongest souls do not endure forever. Time leaves nothing untouched. And while they continued, life in the change crept near, not as a sudden storm, but as a cold breeze creeping slowly until it snuffed out the fire. Their decline did not come in a single night. Neanderthal civilization did not collapse in a single blow. The end began as a whisper, a small shift in the wind, then grew slowly, like a cold cloud no one noticed, until it swallowed everything. At first, the climate shifted. This was not new to the Neanderthals, who had endured long ages of change and survived many winters. But what came around 40,000 years ago was different. This cold was harsher, longer. Resources dwindled. Animals they had long hunted began to vanish or migrate farther away. Each winter brought new loss: a smaller herd, a fire that died faster, a cave sealed by ice, a child who could not survive the frost. Even the plants they relied on for food and medicine became scarce. Water froze in streams, forcing families to break ice each morning with their bare hands. Hunting was no longer a daily venture. It became a battle against hunger, fear, and exhaustion. Everything grew harder. Then, a strange smoke appeared on the horizon. Not the smoke of fire, but the smoke of a new civilization. Homo sapiens, modern humans, were arriving from the south. Their steps began quietly, small footprints on the edge of forests, faint sounds carried on the wind. But their presence grew day by day. They did not look so different from Neanderthals, though their bodies were leaner, their movements quicker, their ability to adapt greater. They brought with them new tools, different hunting techniques, clearer language, and perhaps stories, myths, dreams. No war was fought, no sword was raised, no cry of battle was heard, yet there was a conflict, silent, invisible, not in the body, but in balance. Neanderthals, accustomed to living in small, scattered groups, could not match the spread of these newcomers, shared resources, built networks of relations, and gradually claimed the land, not out of conquest, but simply in pursuit of survival. Just as Neanderthals had done before them, in some places, the two peoples may have lived side by side, at least for a time. Evidence even suggests they interbred, and children were born carrying the blood of both. But the balance could not hold. Slowly, the caves fell silent. Places once alive with firelight, whispers, and laughter faded into emptiness. Forests where they once hunted grew quiet. Paths once worn by their steps vanished under snow and time. The air was no longer the same. The cold was harsher, but it was not the only reason. There was something else, unseen, untouchable, pressing upon them. Their souls carried a strange feeling of shrinking, of slowly fading away. In every group, one person vanished, then two, until no one remained. Not because they did not fight, but because the world changed faster than they could endure, harsher than they could withstand. Sometimes, the end of a people does not come in battle, but in a silence no one notices. And this is what happened to the Neanderthals. They were not defeated, they disappeared. As the steam from a child's mouth disappears on a cold morning, little by little, until only memory and fragments of bone remained. But even after their disappearance, some questions were left unanswered. Who was the last of them? And did they know that the end was near? That is what we will try to approach in the next part. No one knows who the very last of them was. Perhaps it was an old man sitting in a small cave, staring at the footprints of his loved ones on the muddy ground. Or perhaps it was a woman holding a child, weakened by the cold, singing to him in a melody unlike our words, yet overflowing with love. Or maybe it was a small child, the last to carry that ancient blood in his body, playing alone in the corners of an abandoned cave before his voice fell silent forever. Imagine that final moment. A small fire about to die out, a body wrapped in bearskin, stone walls blackened with soot. Outside the cave, a snowstorm screamed across the land, covering everything in frost. And inside, two eyes staring into the darkness in complete silence. No one hears, no one will come. And though the Neanderthals left behind no temples, no statues, no palaces, they left something deeper. They left a mark within us. In the early 21st century, in 2010 to be exact, genetic studies proved that modern humans still carry traces of Neanderthals in their DNA. Small percentages, between 1 and 4%, but real when their paths and ours crossed. And so, their disappearance was not absolute. True, they no longer walk the earth, but their blood still flows in our veins, in the bones of some of us, in the shape of our faces, in how our bodies respond to certain diseases, perhaps even in our senses, or in something unseen, a faint echo of the old memory we carry deep within. And today, when we look at our reflection in the mirror, perhaps we see old shadows that belong to that distant age. Perhaps, in the silence of night, when all else fades, we feel that something deep within us does not belong to the present, but to a past that never truly left. And so, the story of the Neanderthals ends. not with noise, not with light, but with a long silence, like snow covering the world without a sound. They were not myths, not just a shadow in the record of evolution. They were human. They had faces, dreams, fear, and love. They lived as we live, but in a world unlike ours, harsh, wild, merciless. And still, they tried. Perhaps we will never know everything they felt, or wished, or hoped would be said about them after they were gone. But it is enough to know that they lived here, that they walked the same forests we walk today, and looked up at the same sky we see now. And when we fall silent and truly listen, perhaps we can still hear something of their story inside us, in an old shiver we cannot explain, in a nameless longing, in a tear that falls without reason, because the past does not vanish, it whispers, and it is enough that we listen.